It's the Bird Emergency. I'm Grant Williams. I'm a bird nerd, and this is where I get to introduce you to other bird nerds, all with far more expertise and experience than me. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce Neil Hamilton, who is the principal, the head man of Ghostbird Consulting. Now, those of you in Australia will have an idea of what a fair bit of our discussion might be about, given that name. But Neil, welcome. Thanks for joining me. How about we start with where you are right now and what you've been working on most recently, and then we'll take a trip back in the time machine.
Yeah, good afternoon, Grant and viewers. Yeah, we're just kicking off today. Just have a bit of an interview with Grant. It's going to be terrific to get on to what I'm doing. Presently, just been working at home, organising a few upcoming trips for the year 2022, and some volunteers to come out for future desert trips. We spend a lot of
Now,
time.
okay, that's your sort of current projects of field working and monitoring, surveying with volunteers. But how did you get into birds? How did you get into conservation?
Well, that's a long story. Like everyone, I think it dates back to when I had good parents that were very interested, and especially my father, in conservation. And growing up in New South Wales, around North, worked in Taronga Park earlier on, but coming back, we worked and lived on a place called French's Forest on the upper north shore of Sydney, and I was fortunate enough to get into Taronga Park at an early age, around about 17, and from there started a keeping career with Taronga
How,
Park.
can I just jump in on you there, Neil? How does in the old days, in the olden days when I think the horse and cart were done with by then, but how did someone get into zookeeping at 17? Because I think now the pathway is graduates only, isn't it? So there's got to be a story in that. How did you get into working at Tooronga Zoo?
Well, basically, you just put your name down and register at the zoo at that time. And this is back in about 1973. And like everyone, I was keen to work with animals and wildlife. And I'm also got a keen interest in botany. But lo and behold, one day after my name was put in there, it came up and I started as a junior keeper in Taronga Park. And from there, we had to go into they started also an animal care course, an animal wildlife course in Sydney Tech. And it was a 3-year course, and from there we progressed. In those years, we had to work on all the sections, including marine, which was fantastic to get those life experiences and hands-on. And there was no vets in those days either, so we had to really do a lot of hands-on and moving animals and so forth.
So that grounding at Taronga, very generalist in terms of working with all the animals. How long did your career at Taronga last? And did you consider yourself an ecologist without the university degree, or like how did you view yourself? Where did you place yourself as a conservationist at that time?
Well, at that time, from doing the courses and doing all the animals, I ventured out into joining the local bird clubs and the New South Wales Ornithological Group and museums. And we also had a zoological society group. And if those that know Taronga Park, it used to hold its meetings upstairs in the big entrance area. It met a lot of really good people in those days. And those people that came through and studying from the museum, people like John Disney, Walter Bowles, and even a guy called Basil Marlowe in the mammals. In those early days, you'd just touch base with those people. And we'd share a lot of knowledge and skills. I spent a lot of time in the bush with mates and friends like everyone else, and spent a lot of time bird watching. Travelled around the state quite a bit, spent a lot of time in different habitats, phytogeography areas. But in the early days, a lot of those animals they're looking after today and recovery plans. We had numbats for the first time there in the 70s. We had a lot of overseas animals, virtually a collection. And the Edward Horstrom is a known collector, so you name it, he brought it into Australia. And it also, those animals ended up in a lot of the other major zoos. So we had a lot of connections through all the other zoos as well. And birds, at the time, I was never allowed to work on the bird sections. I had to go through the ranks, work on all the mammals. That was a fantastic experience. So from there, I got interested in a lot of mammals and reptiles. But birds was my favourite time, and studying those all the time with people. You just ventured out. You went out camping, went out travelling, and you spent a lot of time in the bush.
It is a zoo career nowadays similar, do you think? Do people get the opportunity to work across the entire collection? And is there as much field work like you were exposed to for a beginning keeper now? Do you know? Is that a fair?
Well, it's a fair question. It's changed a hell of a lot. I mean, zoos used to collect. I used to be on the collecting trips and had my licenses to collect birds for the zoos, and we'd go out and collect the species mainly for education and conservation purposes. But the roles definitely changed from those early days under Ronald Strawn, the first director, who was my first director in Taronga Park. Put a lot of emphasis on Australian fauna. He steered away from exotics quite a bit, and even though they were always there. And then the open range zoo came on board a bit later. So big animals got moved out of the major zoos into the open range zoos. But connections around not just Australia, but the world, a lot of things were changing with recovery plans. We just didn't have that stamp collection. That through those 70s, there was a stamp collection. Going into the 80s, it changed it quite a bit. As I moved through the ranks in the keeping areas, we end up, as a curator later on, we end up organising meetings every year to work out the aviary or the bird collections. And that was quite a hard task at the time because we wanted to bring species, I guess, into different categories and 1 to 4. And we actually tried to look at the important ones of the day, of that sort of time that were on the threat or going extinct or had some possibility of being going extinct. So we used and divided certain criteria. We also listed species that would need help in the future. And some places like Adelaide Zoo had the big breeding collection of golden shoulder parrots in the 70s. That was the thought there. Even back that time, even though golden shoulders now are heavily worked on and through various reasons, they're probably going on the brink as well. And there's some great work going on there at the moment. But we had things like orange-bellied parrots. Adelaide Zoo had orange-bellied parrots in the 70s. And then there was a guy in Tasmania. So we've done a lot of homework collectively.
So we've jumped from Taronga to Adelaide and Tasmania. You started at Taronga when you were 17. When did you finish at Taronga, and where were you in the pecking order at that stage, and where did you move to after Taronga?
Well, through those years, I went up the ranks, as you do as a keeper, and up to head keeper at that time in Taronga Park. And over that period, it was really developing those hands-on skills and life skills that I guess these days I like to be a mentor to a lot of those people. I then ended up moving to Western Australia and started working in Perth Zoo. So in Taronga, I was there for around 12 years. Things came along, life changes, ended up getting married. And when I was on exchange in Perth Zoo, met a lovely lady and her family's been terrific. And we ended up moving back in 84. I started back in Perth Zoo then.
And what was the collection at the Perth Zoo, excuse me, like at that stage? And was it as heavily focused on conservation and recovery as Taronga was at that point in time?
Oh, yeah, it started to, the trends in all the zoos in Australia and around the world started to change quite significantly. And I guess through those changes, the times changed, but the people you have a keen passion for wildlife and research and protection and all the other. But the director at the time, a guy called Thomas Spence, had a lot of connections overseas. He came from the UK, Scotland, so he developed a very significant bird collection, and it was quite outstanding. And to say the least, there's some outstanding keepers there, and those keepers were passionate about their work. And coming in and sharing those knowledge and skills with those people, we developed what I believe, a good collection over time. It changed quite a bit. It changed away from collecting birds out of the wild as well, because the emphasis had to be on breeding quite a bit. So certain species had to be bred also. And those species were then shared with all the zoological gardens around Australia, and if not the world.
So that's a really interesting area to go down, which I probably will come back to it. But when you arrived at Perth, the collection, I imagine, would have had a lot of West Australian species, and a number of those now on the brink. So was there a successful breeding program of, maybe the most at-risk current species in the Perth collection, or were you all still learning how to breed those birds? And the ones I'm talking about. I mean, there's the western ground parrot, noisy scrub bird, western whip bird, the carnabies, black cockatoo. There's a couple more. You got the bristle bird. Were any of those in the collection, and were any of them able to be bred? I didn't look up any of the literature. I'm sorry, Neil, but I'm sure you can tell me if some of them are just too hard.
No, the collection was quite unique in itself. And of course, there was the black cockatoos, all the species there. There was a number of other golden shoulders, the reefers, big collections of birds. But the idea of those times was to bring in some sort of strategy, I said earlier. So under recovery plans and species management plans, the zoos were trying to coordinate a lot more emphasis on those species. But as far as the rarities in the scrub birds and everything else, so the only time they ever came in, there was a great guy called Stephen Davies that I had a lot to do with, and he passed on recently, and terrific. And he also kicked off a bit of bird life that I've been a member since the 70s. But on top of that, he had a big emphasis on looking at those species you mentioned, and the scrubbird actually came into the private hands more so than the zoo, but the zoo actually shared some of the knowledge, but the private people through CSIRO were approached because there's some great aviculturalists out there that do fantastic work, and even today you see them leaning on species that were coming through at the time. And orange-bellied parrots was quite significant, carnabies and various other cockatoos. So we had a collection, but the idea at that time was to branch away, not just within the zoos, but we branched to the fauna parks, we branched to the private aviculturists for ideas, suggestions, support, and it was a two-way of doing that. And I think it was probably a great way because some of the older aviculturists not writing a lot of literature, a lot of it was in their heads, and it just got down to learning more about those species. So, as I said earlier, analog species, common species, you learn a lot from before you deal with the endangered or critically endangered ones.
Do you think that nowadays we are using the skills in the avicultural community as well as we could with breeding some of these? Well, apart from the fact that some of them are difficult to breed, I don't really know where I land on this one. I'd be interested in your thoughts about whether it's actually safeguarding the species to spread the captive collection around to more locations so that one disaster doesn't wipe out a huge proportion, like, psittacosis or something doesn't knock out 50% of the captive orange-bellied parrots, for instance. I don't know where I land on this. What's your thought?
Well, they're great questions, and questions you always have more questions than answers. But over time, one of the critical points is diseases in wildlife, not just birds. And I think the things over the years have really improved, lift their game on wildlife management. That's been notable at Murdoch University over here. And we got involved with that quite a bit. We had vets coming into internships in the zoo. We had a lot of research going, and they were sharing knowledges with the private people as well as the zoo. And over time, technology changed for those medicines to be lifted, improvements on those. Things like beak and feathers in the wild, whether it got there through escape agricultural birds or whether it got through there or turned up naturally. I just can't recall. There's some literature about that somewhere. But even when I was collecting birds in the 70s and 80s for the zoos, parasites were in robins that used to come off farmlands and stuff. So there was turning points all the time. But coming back to the question where they're helping, that I think people are helping all the time, and you never stop learning and increasing that knowledge. Diseases to me is a major factor when you try and do a reintroduction or a translate birds, and I think that's pretty important all around because of the fact that it can infect other birds. And cetaceans or the parrot species around the world are very on notice about that. Even when importations come into Australia, there's a couple of diseases that came in after those importations, which was worrying at the time. So the borders were then closed.
You mentioned reintroductions, translocations. All of those sort of become marginal, don't they? If the habitat isn't protected, shouldn't the first thing be that we are protecting existing standing vegetation that provides habitat for these species that are being bred in captivity with the eventual aim to reintroduce or to do a translocation strategy? Aren't we in some cases putting the chicken before the egg?
Yeah, as I said earlier, learning a lot from analog species is important, no matter how you look at it. But I guess protecting that habitat is foremost. And as you see with a lot of conservation groups around the world, and particularly in Australia, forest clearing, land clearing, got climate change coming on the face. some things may not have a place to be in the future. I guess some of the captive stuff that can hold species, including mammals, and the survival can protect. But overall, long term, if the biodiversity is not protected, and I think that's important. It's not just understanding one species; it's understanding what is actually in that biodiversity whole concept. And I don't think sometimes when we look at some of the things we're going for protection, the whole biodiversity is sometimes needs to be investigated a lot more. And I think not only the ferals, even the native animals that live in those areas, and including the plants, there's a niche for everything, and right down to invertebrates. And I think coming from the zoo background, coming from looking about the big five in Africa, it's okay looking after one species, but I think it's the whole biodiversity. If we're not impacting looking at that whole biodiversity, then species inevitably will be lost. And I think that's the worry from myself and from many people I work with and volunteers I take out. We often discuss all what you're asking here today.
Well, there's no doubt that I don't think many people need to be convinced about protecting an icon species, one that is popular. But increasingly, I ask myself the question, what's the point of saving a little brown bird, for instance, just to coin a phrase, if we don't actually have anywhere for the little brown bird to live? I really struggle with the idea that institutions and governments are all on board with saving the iconic species, but they don't seem to be lifting a finger to be saving significant existing areas of known habitat. They balk at taking that final step. It seems to be, I don't want to label it greenwashing, but it seems to be the easy option and far more acceptable for us to say, all right, let's give $500,000 to 2 private sanctuaries to build up to insulate a safeguard population and insulate against the risks of extinction. What's the point of spending that money, but then not spending 2 or 3 million to buy existing pockets of known habitat and then ensuring that it is livable? Are we close, do you think, in being able to bring the community, therefore all the decision makers and the bean counters, along to the next step in the journey? And it seems like, to me, the logical step in the process.
Well, yeah, the discussion's been going on for years, and I think people I've dealt with for many years, a long time now, everyone's entitled to their views, everyone have different opinions, but to lock everything up is probably not the answer either. But when you do that, there's got to be a two-way of looking on both sides, and captive breeding, people who specialise in that, terrific at the job they're doing. But there's more emphasis on cooperation between not just captive breeding, but to the wildlife, to the scientists, to the technical officers, to the volunteers and citizen sciences are all trying to work together. Community groups are big now. Community groups get a lot of funding, so they're out there doing as much as they can. Even a lot of the pastoralists I work with.
Oh, sorry, Neil, don't cut your answer short when I jump in. I'm really interested in extending that. Everybody you mentioned then is really important and are all part of the success stories. The disconnect is taking the policy, making the action to actually locking up something, not locking up everything. It's only ever presented as being a choice between locking everything up but surely there's a way for marginal farmland or existing crown land or whatnot to just be protected from further development. You don't have to stop anyone doing anything, and you don't have to stop anyone doing anything that they're currently doing. That's what I mean. Or if they can't make money out of it, let's help them make money out of being protectors. I mean, because I share exactly what you said. The conversation's been going on a long time. Isn't it time that the conversation ended and the action started?
Well, I think, totally, Grant. But the thing is that it has been going a long time, even as my father used to say, and people I had, fond memories of talking to, like the Cervantes and the Harry Butlers that I dealt with a bit over here in WA over time, and even Stephen Davies. Spent a lot of time talking to him about it. The same answers to questions that come up time and time again, and I think they'll continue to come up time and time again. What changes is that people are giving their own time to a lot of this work, including my little group and my little ventures, where it's not so much about the money. And money is important, but it's how the money's spent, it's how it's put into place, it's how you interpret what you want to achieve, what you want to save. But I think individual saving of species is good, but as I said earlier, unless you're protecting that whole environment, and you've alluded to that quite as many people do, then where to from here? And I think the range of programs that have started up across with Indigenous people has been fantastic. I have a little bit to do with that myself. But connecting all those people together, even for governments and even for people on recovery teams, it's making that work, and that's a big ask.
Well, you've raised two things that I really want to follow up with. But first, I want to give an acknowledgement to the debt that I owe David and Vincent Saventi, never having met them, but having collected every issue of Australia's Wildlife Heritage and cherishing those 7 binders, the volumes of all of that great natural history stuff. That's where I learnt 90% of what I know about the wild places and the wild animals and the species of Australia and the marine species. So they were great men, and I don't think that they are as widely acknowledged over on the east as they are in the west.
Well, as you know, I think it might have been Don used to live over in New South Wales, where I met him over there, and I think Vincent was in WA when I came here. And having met them quite a few times and having similar discussions, really, like I did with Harry Butler and done with even Gerald Durrell at the time. I got all his paperbacks. He was fantastic in his new way of looking at the zoos, and you just look at that Jersey Trust. Fantastic courses he runs there for people. A lot of the skills and knowledge come out with Madagascar, for example. He focused on that one place there, and before his time in some ways. But if you look at those early, as you said, Saventi, even go back to when I was about on television with my father, and that was a fantastic show. And you had all those other shows that, the Leyland Brothers, and you'd sit there in your TV room and watch those things and say, I'd like to do that one day. But what actually drew to me is getting out there. And I think, we've got what I call a little bit of technology coming along. A lot of it's really good, but you still cannot be living in the wild, living in that field environment and not having showers for a while. And a lot of areas take you to places that, might cost you a bit to get there. Like a lot of twitchers and birdos will fly to the nearest thing that comes into Australia. But I watch all that I laugh a bit, like many other people. I've spoken to people who've taken off to chase those things. But I've been fortunate enough to work in various places. And I think I mentioned earlier, I spent a bit of time in New Guinea in Mount Hagen. That was fantastic in 78. A 24-year-old living up there. And I'm thinking that broke my back to go. And that bloke me that if you can do that, I'll do anything and travel the world a bit, which I did.
Don't go on those kind of twitches, but I really love that other people do. I think that it just highlights the passion for birds, which is why we're talking. Now, you mentioned New Guinea, Mount Hagen. So that means we've jumped in the timeline a little bit. How long were you at the Perth Zoo, and what was next?
18 years I was in Perth Zoo from various stages. When I came over, I spent 18 really good years there. The zoo changed. Native breeding programs came along. They're fantastic. They've supported a lot of wildlife. The cooperation right around government and private has improved a hell of a lot. And I've taken myself coming into retirement an eye-opener to share what I have, those skills I have, to pass that on to volunteers and try and be a mentor. One thing I notice a lot, that I do a lot with students, and that the mentoring is so important. So if I can leave that legacy and mentor a lot of great people and a lot of great students coming through, and I'm dealing a bit with Curtin University on some other areas that have been fantastic, and one of the ex-students that was an honours student and PhD, we're working quite close together on a lot of the aspects of her work, and then takes it into the desert. But New Guinea was good. The zoo was fantastic, and I've just moved into wildlife research a lot more over the years, and as I said, moving into retirement.
Well, I promoted our discussion as the story of the Ghostbird. So a lot of your research and your efforts now in the Night Parrot, the mythical Ghostbird of Australia, which when I was laying on the lounge room floor as a 10, 11, maybe 12-year-old, I don't know, loving my Australia's wildlife heritage to death, we were wondering whether anyone would ever see the night parrot ever again. Was it still out there?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and there were enthusiasts of both sides of the argument. No, it's gone, or yes, it's out there. So, how did you get so interested in the night parrot? When did your interest in the night parrot begin?
Well, like a lot of things, I mean, you look at it in boyhood, you read the books, you look at and through the zoo times and through the wildlife research times, you'd come across a lot of things that were happening, and the night parrot was always there, whether to be found or not. And John Young did a terrific job doing that, I guess, for his time. And prior to that, we worked towards in the arid zones quite a bit. I was fortunate enough to go out there and spend a lot of time there, both work and privately. And over time, I got to know a lot of the pastoralists. So a lot of the pastoralists would tell me stories. And a lot of the other people that I spoke to around the environmental and wildlife research areas, it's extinct. And that was the bottom line. It's gone. Papers were written that it had gone. And then I was fortunate enough to see one in 2009 with it. And prior to that, the people who were out there at the stations and the caretakers, they actually had seen the birds, and their fathers and forefathers had seen that bird living in the areas that I've been going.
Did it frustrate you that the idea that it was extinct was so firmly held in academia? And is that one of the weaknesses in the system? Because I imagine now that it would be very difficult if John Young hadn't proved the existence of the bird. It would be very hard to get funding from any source, wouldn't it, to keep doing expeditions searching for the bird? So is that a weakness, that the skill, the thrill of adventure seems to have gone from research?
No, I don't think it's always there. And the thing that actually gets a lot of, to me anyway, is it's intriguing to look at anything that's endangered, vulnerable, extinct, or whatever. But unless you put the yards in and look at what, actually having seen that bird in 2009, the bottom line was at the time, no one believed, myself and a colleague, no one actually understood the significance of it. I think at the time we came back, and I used to have an old pocket tape recording, and we made a recording as we saw it on that night. And from there, it's now in the library here in our DBCA division, but that recording. But to significantly to understand and bring something out that wasn't about made it extremely difficult, especially without a photo. And so we spent time trying to work out how to deal with it. And in actual time, no one actually wanted us to release any of the information. The pastoralists didn't want to talk about it.
So what was the recording of? Was it the bird calling, or was it you and your colleague saying, hey, this is what we're seeing right now? Or tell us about the recording, and then tell us about that conflict with no one wanting to talk about it because it might have impacted on significant... I'm assuming this is what you were saying, why the pastoralists would object, because it might impact on their economic activity.
Yeah, rightly so. The care who over the last 20 years I have a fantastic respect for. And from there, I could understand where they were coming from. I could all understand the big questions at the time. How do we deal with it? We had little meetings between our group out there at the time, and it was so frustrating to think how to deal with it. So I spoke to a few people, my immediate boss and other people, and to deal with that at the time was, oh shit, you must have been pissed, you must have been drinking, and you must have had other things. And all those things came into play. And I guess the thing that was foremost in our minds that I need to record, the best way I record this was through that tape recording, an old tape deck, and emphasise that. See, when you find something, and from experience, you can say, yes, you've seen it, but at that time, phone cameras and everything else you don't have. So you have to put everything down straight away, whether it's in writing or, and in my case, I did it on a tape recording. So I knew straight after, an hour after, that went straight on the tape deck.
So did anyone believe you at the time, apart from the fella who was standing next to you?
No, there was 6 sightings that year by about 4 or 5 people. And the whole concept of that just changed significantly, where there was thoughts, there was things we had to do. We had to, at times we think about how to go about it. We got support. At the time, I was also working in the Pilbara with Mike Bamford and volunteering a lot of with Dr. Mike Bamford on the Fortescue Marsh. And in that time, the same thing happened up there. So there's long stories and long, I guess, history that presently it's been documented. Myself and a couple of good friends putting a lot of things together, and in time it'll all come out.
Well, as is my usual want, Neil, we've jumped ahead in the story. A lot of people in Australia won't know about the night parrot, but more for our international friends. Tell us about the night parrot. Actually, place yourself back before you saw the bird in 2009. Where did you think it lived at that time, and what was so special and curious about the night parrot? Why was it an icon for you?
Well, when we actually seen the bird, and previously a lot of work, I spent a lot of time out there, and I used to talk to colleagues and say, habitat's right. Well, I did a lot of research, of course, like many other people on individual things. And prior to actually seeing the bird, it was in the back of my mind all the time. I'd actually done a lot of work in the Pilbara as well, as I said earlier, after sighting with Rob Davies, and various things happened up there. And we discussed it at length, but at the time, it was hard to believe, I guess, in the concept that who's going to believe us. But when you have 4 or 5 people and the habitat and the similarities that were happening, I knew we were on the money in the contents that, yes, it's here. As I said, the parcels out there had been interviewed a long time, great friends now that had their fathers and husbands and partners that have seen the bird. And today they still record and report to me on the same token. They send me the latest, which is fantastic, because in the areas we are, they're not protected areas, but there's several locations there now that the bird is doing extremely well. And with my small group and the volunteers, we're just trying to tap into some of the things. I think ferals is a big problem with it, but the bird itself, I think, is subject to fire a lot more, but that's not here or there. There's a lot of discussion still going on in the research. But coming back,
it's nocturnal.
Very much so. I was going to say, when you're out there, the bird will come to you most of the time. You just have to sit quietly. And like a lot of birds, a lot of animals, they tend to know the sense. They sense you there. It's like, knows you're there, they'll come and see you. But when you understand the environment it lives in, and not just that bird, many other animals that we're actually detecting there now, it's extraordinary. The desert is to me a frontier that scientists and researchers and all the biodiversity out there is still untouched. We've done a lot of work at various half-hearted sort of things that have been done out there, but to spend time, as much time as you can. The coastline, Australia's coastlines and islands are very well researched, very well explored, but the deserts to me, and the particular area I've been going for a long time, something new every day, even taking what I call great volunteers and expertise in their own right, from spiders to plants. We share that knowledge together, and it's a small group, small team. Different people come along at different times, and we don't have any funding. We just go out spend our own time, own money. I do wildlife tours at the moment, and in the early days I was confident in my own budgets, but not to discuss with my wife and family here, but at times they knew what I was wanting to do, and I think the fantastic thing is they were supportive. At times they could see the look on their face, but at times they knew there was an objective there to continue. That was important.
Well, if we're ever allowed back into Western Australia, Neil, I would love to come along on one of your tours. The desert is somewhere that certainly haven't spent enough time in. Certainly not the West Australian desert. And it's a far different beast to that which we find here in New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia. But there's a lot of stories. There's a lot more stories, and hopefully in future those stories will come out. As I said, we've been doing a lot more work in different aspects of this, and people that I know and people that I've worked with have been tremendous. And on the other side of that, the out there will continue well past me. I've just got to leave a legacy, hopefully to leave it on some great people that will follow through. I mean, we've got a big banding site out there as well, bird banding site, which emphasise a lot of the things that are going on. So, yeah. Now, you mentioned the Indigenous Australians, the traditional owners who were occupying still had links with the land in 2009. I want you to, again, try and cast your mind
Well,
back then. How much were researchers tapping into Indigenous knowledge and giving real credibility to what those groups who had been on those sites and their method of recording history was the oral tradition? How
yeah,
much credibility did the science community give to observations that they were telling you and people like you about the night parrot?
oh, a hell of a lot. When we started going there and things were working through with the Martu, I guess, we developed a lot of good connections, and myself in particular, along with a guy called Simon Cherryman. And we worked on different aspects as he started doing his PhD with me out in the deserts, and he asked for help. And to see a big guy cry when you catch a wedgetail for his part of his PhD, he's done some terrific work in that area, and it's going on today. And we connected with a school out there, a place called Walloona. Once we connected with the school, we introduced little programs together with the kids. The teachers came on board, the community came on board, the elders, been terrific. And there's heaps of people there that can tell you stories that you sit there and wonder about. Wow, they've got stories, and I've got stories, and to share that knowledge together, and we're passing that on to the children. And that to me is one of the most things that I got out of the zoo days. Education and the children are coming through the next generations. If they're not picking up a lot of this stuff, then I'm wasting my time. And I think the people we work with and the elders out there, they know it. They often tell me, we often sit around in the bush, we look at different things, we share knowledge on land quite a bit. They're so helpful. And I think Simon, myself and others have come along board, and we've shared that knowledge. We're working together. A lot of communities have, like many other communities, whether it's whitefellow communities, blackfellow communities, we all have issues and problems, but together we share that and work through it. But the kids that are coming through, they're really keen, and they're going to school a lot more. We had a big roll up last year of 30 odd kids in the local school, and when you see that, this big blow, my heart just pounds out and saying, well, we've got to get through them, and they're coming on board. Simon and other people that have developed this program for the kids is second to none, and the two-way science is on board now too, that we see a lot in WA.
Oh, that's great that there's obviously going to be continuity, that things aren't reliant solely on you. That's the real important thing, is to leave a framework behind that can just be replicated in different communities. But you keep talking about, Neil, tell us how many are in it, how can people get involved or follow the activities?
As you know, the Twitter accounts and to set up the Ghostbird side for that. It's not big, but what we do, I'm a believer that small groups achieve big things. When they've got too many cooks in the kitchen, it blows out and causes anxieties, problems, frustration between various people. I see it all. I've had that when I was managing a lot of people in my curatorial and director's days, and even when I did a lot of firefighting for 40 odd years too, and worked a lot in fires in New South Wales and WA. So I'm a believer that small teams achieve the big things and get what you're looking for. And when I ask for volunteers, they often say, I'm coming out. And I see when people come out once or twice, but the ones who come out quite keen, and I think we're nothing big at this point in time. We haven't gone out and promoted ourselves as being wanting funding. A lot of the volunteers pay their own way, and I try and support them a bit with food and fuel. But at times we just can't grow enough because we find we don't have that funding support to do that. But we do have what we call people support. We have pastoral support. We have Walloona community support. And by doing that, we trunch out there for 2 or 3 weeks. To come on board, I often look at how people can help. As I said, different skills, help and achieve different things and what we're trying to look for. And I guess working towards, retirement in the future, then spend more time and try and get out there. We go out about 4 or 5 times a year if we can, but various people come, as I said, from all different walks of life. But I look, when someone sends me an email or a friend of a group or a friend comes out, I have a chat to those people, see what they're really interested in and why they want to come out. I used to have a saying, and some of the volunteers used to ask me, you're going to give me 100%? And I used to say, I want 110%. And they say, oh, what's the 10%? I said, well, 10% is fine. It's what you're looking for. And in those early days with some great people, when we found the night parrots, we worked hard. And the life stories there are tremendous, and hats off to people that came out. Just 2 or 3 individuals that spent a lot of time with me, spent a lot of time actually living. I mean, we start at 3 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and go to 7 o'clock daybreak researching and looking at the night parrot and everything else that's involved in this whole environment. So we've put together some really good, interesting notes, draft notes, and we support what we can to each other. And I think having done that was good. But there's stories for later on.
Yep. But if somebody is watching and they think and they've got a passion for bird research, would you suggest somebody who has not been on field work trips already would be suitable, or would you be suggesting that they should perhaps hone their skills and perhaps their endurance a little bit before approaching you or someone like you who's doing work in the desert? Because it's pretty hardcore, isn't it?
Well, definitely. Yeah, it's not for the faint-hearted at times. I mean, we've tried to get out in different times and different periods of what what's actually going on. But it can. I mean, I know of. I've heard of plenty of stories where people have perished, and plenty of stories that pastoralists have told me. We have the main goal we have out there, I guess, is good support, as I said earlier, from whether it's the Wiluna community and the pastoralists, connecting all those together. There is some good support, and when we go out, the fundamental survival, if you like, the water and the fuel and the food, and supporting each other. I think that's also, I don't take out more than 10, maybe 12 at a time with 2 or 3 vehicles that come along, because we're all conscious of what can happen out there. And I guess if people are contacting me about that, emphasise or ask what their experiences are, how they've gone about them. 9 times out of 10, I know virtually the people and who the people are, friends of friends, and we tee it all up. We have a little bit of a team meeting or a briefing, and we get on with it, I guess. And we have that support. If we do have a problem, then the pastoral's been fantastic for our support. And the community of Shire and people in that community, we've often come across each other at different times and help one another if they're broken down. But you're right, it's a tough gig. It's not for the faint-hearted. We spend a lot of time. And as I said, the reason I usually do the small side of stuff is that if you've got too many people, then there's concern whether heat stress or accidents and slips and spills and everything else you go along with, which is emphasised pretty big these days in anywhere you're working. And that's a really important thing. So people can contact me. I talk to a lot of people, and I've had people from overseas already contact me and interstate who I've known, and a lot of past and people I work with want to come out. So, and there's always something to see and do. And we all take turns in cooking and things like that.
Yeah. Are you looking for anything else apart from the night parrot when you are out on your surveys, or are you able to jam a few things into the one pack?
No, we do more than what we normally do out there. As I said, there's a bird banding site we've established since 2013, and we're training people in that aspect, handling and all that. We also do a lot of the people, as I said earlier. We might have a lady or a person, male or female, come along and have expertise in botany or expertise in reptiles. And as I said earlier, I've drifted away a little bit from the actual night parrot, even though I know it's there all the time, and people sometimes come out want to see or hear one. 9 times out of 10 they do. The other times we emphasise on this whole biodiversity out there, and it's on private land, and the biodiversity is showing up stuff that, and sometimes the country and the desert's so big you don't know what's out there. And we've found things like lesser stick nest, rat's nest, and other small mammals that aren't supposed to be in that area. So we're combining all that together because they all live together. And the emphasis is on that, as said, that whole ecology and biology, and it's not just about that night. Even though the groups now consult Ghostbird volunteers or Ghostbird consultants, which I've established, that is just the pinnacle, or the species that we use as the symbol, that more than just a night parrot.
As the icon, everyone needs an icon. Have you been constantly surveying the same sites, or are you bringing new sites in to the study area over the period, Neil?
No, several sites we actually go to and visit, and one trip you get to more of them, so I might alternate a bit on different aspects of it. The pastoralists have been, actually said, been tremendous, where you can duck in and get support from those people. Without their support, and without their contacts, like you could be left stranded, and that's when problems happen. That's where people perish. That's where accidents happen. We meet people on the road. I've met people all the time and ask what you're doing and sharing various aspects. No, it's not. There's several locations we go to, and I mean, we started. I think I didn't mention that earlier on, but I think when I started going there 20 odd years ago, there was only 70 species of birds there, and we were up to 161. And things that you thought weren't going to be there have turned up at different periods, different times of the year, whether it's been heavy rains or dry periods. We come across, and I actually do a lot with the WA Museum a bit as well. And as I said, being associated with Curtin University these days, they're pretty keen to establish more research. That's what I'm after.
There's so much more to talk about these trips, Neil, and I think we'll have to agree to follow up a bit more on another occasion. But before I get to my standard bird emergency questions, the show's called The Bird Emergency. It's about rare birds.
Yep.
Now, usually I concentrate on birds that are critically endangered, if that's possible. What's your gut feeling about the status of the night parrot?
The gut feeling is terrific work being done now by the Indigenous groups and the scientists. I think still a hell of an unknown. Population to me is probably unknown. I think I still read a lot of the latest papers that come out. There are people around that have done terrific. Nick Leesberg's work in the PhD, I think, is going to be pretty outstanding. He spent a little bit of time with me. I think there's a lot more to know. Indigenous people and the two-way science, it seems to be going very well. Where I don't think we still don't know to this day what the status is on it. There's estimated, we're given their numbers, but to me, when you find in the pockets, you've got a small group, 4 or 5 birds at different times, and you might only have a couple. Depends on what the scenario is. And incidentally, WA landscape and everything is quite a bit different to the landscape through Queensland that I've been to a few times. And so the vast areas this bird living and moving, there's still a lot unknown. And that's maybe not so much for me now. I think if I can pass a lot of that skills and knowledge on, I think next generation, next good scientists are coming through and volunteers and technical officers, whatever, they'll pick some of this stuff up and learn from it. I did a lot of work earlier on, Grant, just touch on base. I did a lot of work on ground parrots, western ground parrots and eastern ground parrots, and I did a lot of look at realities of different views on that. And we can talk about this later on, but another time. But when you go back and look at those birds and look at the night parrots and what Andrews had established in his first paper on night parrots, then I went right back to that history of Andrews to develop where we got to today and where it all came from after the sighting in 2005 by Davies and then ours in 2009. And a lot of it as looking at those and looking at, as I said earlier, analog species. You can learn a lot from a very common bird as an analog species to a critically endangered one. If you tap into those characteristics of an analog species, then you move forward into critically endangered birds. And that goes with the captive breeding as well. And that's why I think there's been more emphasis on captive breeding and cooperation with scientists, as I said earlier.
So do you think fire is the single biggest threat to the night parrot, or would you say predation by invasive species is perhaps the number one threat?
Well, number ones. I think there's an interesting thing. I work a lot on ferals and done so for 20 odd years. But the thing that I'm learning now, going back out into the sites, is that there's a lot of landscapes being naturally protected from fire, but a lot of the areas where the old spinifex, which has been burnt for a long time, it has its own, what I said earlier, has its own whole diversity in there. And there's various threats to a night parrot in there that, apart from cats, and even now foxes are moving out to some of these areas that in my time of research, the foxes never did a lot of time out there, but mining sites are moving through. Mining sites potentially could have a lot of factors on this particular bird, which I believe will do. But when I emphasize on fire, what I'm seeing in my own little group of people I take out there and looking further, the potential of fire, once a fire goes through, then it creates havoc for everything, and not just introduced species, but for the native one. And that's why I have a bit of an emphasis on fire. So fire to me with this night parrot is up there. Ferals is also up there, but the ferals come in after fire and wipe everything else out. But I think fire, once it wipes the landscape out, and you've seen that on the eastern seaboard, then you've lost a lot of stuff, including what you've been researching on. And I can't emphasise enough, diversity in that landscape is so important, and you've got to know everything that's going on and and you never know, you never stop learning. So that's the key for me in working out there in that desert.
It's going to be quite exciting, I think, as you mentioned Nick Leesberg and all of the other people who have been doing fairly long-term studies now, or significant time studies on the bird, the same sites returning over and over again. It's going to be exciting to read their findings and then see what develops, or what the next group of PhD candidates pick up and run with. I think we're in for an exciting time when it comes to talking about the Ghostbird.
Yeah, very much so. I didn't mention earlier, but we've done a lot of work on bird parrots living in the same habitat, and we're working on actually all the parrots out there at the moment because of those connections in feeding and habitats and how they breed, etc. So, to me, understanding birks, who sometimes refer to as night parrot, then it's fairly common where we're working and banding them and so forth. So you learn from them, and as I said, you're not interfering a lot with the endangered.
Old habits die hard, Neil. I think, aren't we having to refer to Burke's parrot or Burke's parakeet as the sunset parrot now?
I love it. I love the sunset parrot, and I've used that a few times. And as I said, the pink cockatoo instead of the major, and things that are coming through. I've seen a lot of changes, as you have, and it's changing all the time. But I love the word sundown parrot, and I also think that's when you see them the best time. But to work with them and to look at those birds in that environment with the night parrot and the mulgars, and as I said, I think we've got 7 or 8 different parrot species out there. We're looking at the generalistic of what they're doing, and they're all in the night parrot habitat. And the other side of that, we've got raptor species there that Simon and I have been touching in on, that predation, certain raptors out there. But these are all stories that we can talk about again in the future, but we're looking at aspects that affect in the whole sequence, not just introduced. But
and I'm a big fan of the bird names for birds, and the more Indigenous names that we can get into common usage, I think the better. I think it's a little bit difficult in Australia because we've got so many different Indigenous names that refer to the same bird, but I'm sure we can overcome that in the decades to come.
I certainly will. I think that's another change in way where we're working a lot more with the communities, a lot more with the Indigenous groups. We've got ranger programs that are going right through the country, and I think having those range of programs is, to me, I think when I look back and look back where I was in 2005 and 9 with the night parrots and working with people in the Kimberley, in the Pilbara we had Indigenous people at the time I was there with Mike, looking for the birds, sharing their knowledge. And I think what we're doing now in the communities in the school at Wiluna and what we're doing with the pastoralists, it's very hard. It's not, don't get me wrong, it's a really interesting world when you deal with pastoralist communities and people. Generally, there are tough times out there. There have been tough times. There are trying times, and there's discussions, not arguments, I call them discussions, that to and fro all the time, that you can come up with the good answers and you can come up with working with each other. And I think if we're not doing that and going the same direction, then I'm not going to be wasting my time out there doing that. And I guess at the end of the day, I'll do that, and I'll work with the great people that I take out and the volunteers. And I think the only thing I can say about volunteers and citizen scientists is I just think the length and breadth of Australia, if not the world, have put a lot of time and effort in. I think, taking a quote from a friend of mine, we're looking at some of the times where I volunteered a lot in the fire brigade, and then I went into the department, and then I worked into looking at volunteers and their time. I think citizen science volunteers, the jobs that the students have, a lot of PhD, a lot of students get in all the accolades and the education, but what's happening, the workforce is not there for these people to come into. And I think in some ways, citizen science and volunteers, some of the jobs have been taken away a little bit from there. And if those jobs need to come back into the government areas and into the private areas where we're paying a lot of these citizen science and volunteers, because they're doing great work, but I don't think they need jobs now. And unless the students, a lot of students coming out, but there's no jobs. And I speak to quite a few of them. If there's no jobs and the scientists and volunteers and the citizen science are doing that work, then I think we need to create more jobs for the up-and-coming students which there's some terrific people.
It's the great conundrum of our time because governments love to find a different way to get the work done, but not pay a cent for it. So
Well,
it's
private's like that too. You've got some great organisations, Bush Heritage, AWC. I've heard about that. Other ones, Rewilding, other organisations coming in. They're employing a lot of people. And I think when I started in, if you want to call conservation zoos, it wasn't about the money. It was about how much you can give. And I often say to students and people, sometimes you can think from your heart, but it's the head you need to think of. Like someone said, well, how'd you feel when you held a night parrot? Well, I said, well, just like any other parrot at the time, because that's how you treat it. But think from your head, not from your heart.
When you're sitting around the campfire having a few reds, you can expand more about your feelings about the night parrot, Neil.
Oh, we do, yeah, and people share that all the time. That's one of the beauties of it, and you may not see it, hence why it's called Ghostbird Consultants, hence why it's called the Ghostbird. It's there, it watches you, and even the Indigenous people know that, as I was speaking to many of them, and I've taken them, some of them down there. You see it, then you don't see it, sorry, you hear it, and you know it's there, but you very rarely see it.
Okay, well, one more question for you before we kick into the bird emergency questions, Neil. I don't want to call you an old timer because, as we discovered in our earlier correspondence, you haven't actually got that many more years on me. So I don't want to be throwing monikers like that around just yet. But you've had a long career, like from when you were 17, starting at Tooronga Zoo, moving through a number of government bodies, a number of zoos, different places overseas, making heaps and heaps of contacts, being involved in citizen science. What do you think is the greatest conservation success that you've seen?
For me, I mean, eradication of islands around the world are protecting species now, whether it's mice, rats or cats, and protection of islands is up there for me. And as I said earlier, I've done a little bit of work on Christmas and Cocos, but there for other times. But I guess, islands, some of the arc stuff, I think the emphasis is on focusing on mammals in there. I think they're looking more to focusing on some of the other species that can live in those environments. So I think we're seeing peninsulas fenced off now, protecting a lot of species. That's a good thing. But I guess for me, a lot of the island work I've done over the years has been up there amongst it all.
Well, that's just given me some more ideas of some more people to talk to in the future. Now, we will have further conversations because you've raised some really good issues that I want to look into a little bit more. So I will invite you back. But before we wrap up, I've got to ask you the bird emergency questions. So are you ready? Neil, what is your field guide of choice?
Whoa, believe it or not, I carry 4 or 5 around with me because I like to look at all the different, whether it's wing molts or patterns on birds or birds generally descriptions. So in the early days, I had slater quite a bit over in the eastern coast. Pissies and the latest bird life one I use a lot now. And I use the apps a lot. I think the apps have been a godsend for me. And writing a lot of the notes I used to do, doing the bird apps, and adding the data in, I think is really important, given that I travel a lot. And it's made a life-bearing thing for me.
Okay, so let's extend that answer a little bit. Which apps do you use and which apps do you use to record your data?
Well, I use the BirdLife for recording BirdLife data app, and I use the Morecambe app quite a bit. But I never go past because I always have the field guides with me as well. Because when you're around the campfires and someone's got a question, you can go back to the old Slater books, or you can go back to Pissies, or you can go back to the Simpson and Days and all the others that I carry. You can look into those and just share. I think that's one of the beauties about camping or field work. If you can sit around and talk about, then you can talk about an individual bird as well.
Isn't that one of the great things about sharing experiences with other birders? But the thing that always amazes me is how the same bird can look so different in 4 or 5 different field guides.
Yes, very true. And there's another one coming out by WA Museum shortly that Ron Johnson's doing. So yes, and that goes around the world. Even when I travel through Asia and America and UK, and you see those similar books, and there's a lot more seem to come out all these days, and it costs a lot of money. My father and I used to spend, and I inherited a lot of his books, And one day, I don't know where they're all going to go, but some of them that I have good fond memories with, certain people I got to know, I said earlier, is ask me and you'll see who I'm quite a few times, different books. But I guess at the end of the day, yeah, technology is coming forward. I do have some concerns with playbacks, I guess, and I do have concerns with disturbances on wildlife generally. But that's one of the things I hope to mentor and help people understand that the more they interfere, the more disturbance happens and the more loss and the more things you'll lose.
Yes, not only research but photography and whatnot. As more people want to see and experience rare birds, what's really acceptable needs to be continually talked about, I think.
Very true. I think it's respect as well. It's earning respect. I think that's what I've lived and building teams and earning that respect. And you don't get it out of it. You have to learn and listen to people and understand what they're doing and where you're coming from, where I'm coming from. And I guess at the end of the day, that's why I guess the teams I take out, it's been a godsend for me and support.
Okay. What is your favourite / most essential piece of equipment when you are out on your field work? Can't you live without when you're out there?
Can't live without, apart from water. Well, I have a backpack that's always ready to go, like everyone else does probably. I often get asked if someone needed something, they'll have it. So going through that, I've learned the hard way. I've learned to take what I could. So I guess, good question. I think apart from survival gear, the normal standard stuff, and having plenty of water, then I guess a sat phone's pretty important, or an EPIRB for where I'm going quite a bit.
Now, just diverting just a little bit, I've just watched 7 series of Alone on SBS On Demand, which is that show where they dump the people out in the wilderness, not in the desert, obviously.
Yeah.
Have you got a ferro stick?
No.
I've never met anyone who's got one, but it's the first item that gets packed in that show.
No, as I said, if you're working where I'm going or volunteering where I'm going, then the backpack I take and walk a lot of. I mean, when we're out there, we do a lot of walking, a lot of nighttime stuff, as I said earlier, and working at night is pretty amazing. Doing it for a long time, and you're talking about bird calls and things before. The repertoire of different species of birds have got is extraordinary, and a lot of it's unrecorded. And I think, to me, people coming into the birds and recordings and vocals of species of birds, having worked in zoos and very fond of parrots, having heard night parrots at different times, and I knew we were onto them all the time, that certain calls that I heard end up being the calls that end up getting documented. I think that was a really intriguing way. So if I was a young up-and-coming scientist or keen person, then the repertoire of vocals and species of birds is something to be looked into.
Now, that leads in a little bit nicely, I think, Neil. Well, where's your favourite spot to go observing birds?
My favourite, I have plenty of favourites. Well, I live in Perth here, so I'm right on Lake Joondalup. So Lake Joondalup's probably one of the best birding lakes for me around Perth, because I live nearby. I've watched it develop all around and the species. Christmas Island, I spent a lot of time on over the years, in a bit of Cocos. And I guess the deserts. There's a number of them. Where do I start? Where do I stop, Grant? I've spent a lot of time right through Australia, different areas, and every time you go there, apart from seeing the general things and everything else, you'll see the old one that wasn't there before. So I don't know. I don't have any favourites, but in the deserts are my points.
Well, then let's labour the point then, shall we, Neil? What's your bucket list location? Where's somewhere that you haven't been that you would jump on a plane, train, hike 1,000 miles to get to watch birds if you could?
There's like a lot of that down in it. But when I've done a lot of the states, I guess Cape York would be on the bucket list if I was going to go anywhere to have a look around. I've done most of the other parts of Australia, so Cape York would be up there for a trip.
I'm sure listeners and viewers might be surprised that of all the places you've been, you have not got to Cape York yet. So you won't be alone in that being a bucket list, I think, Neil.
No, I've just done about every other place, but Cape York would probably be a place to go and have a good look at. Been offered quite a few times to go there, but I haven't found the time. Just like a lot of people haven't been in the deserts. As I said earlier, there's talk about putting that road through the Central Desert Road right through Australia. You've probably heard about that, maybe, but there has been talk about that going in. Could be a good, bad thing. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. We won't talk about the edge effect today, but maybe we could talk about that another time. Neil, here's the toughie. What's your favourite bird?
Believe it or not, the birds of paradise and bowerbirds have been in my radar for a long time. I guess they're up there. A lot of the parrots, of course, over time. But favourites, I'm not going to say the night parrot and the contents, so it's something that I've worked towards and looked for. But I guess the birds of paradise that I work with up in New Guinea and in the zoos, I think stand up there, along with that Victoria crown pigeon.
So, which bird of paradise? Ragiana?
21 of them. So I guess the ribbon tail is up there with that. That's pretty specky. So is a sickerbill. But they stand out for me, even when I was working in New Guinea. Oh, sorry, Geelong.
See, we didn't even get to Geelong. That's a whole nother story. What's your bucket list bird, Neil?
Oh, bucket list bird. Well, I don't know. No, I don't really have a bucket list. If I'm out and about, I'll look for something that intrigues me a little bit harder. But no, I don't have a bucket list.
Was hoping that you would have said hawk or something like that.
Well, I used to work with them in Taronga, so I didn't have to. I guess if you're talking around the world, I'd like to go to the Amazon, but I don't think it's going to happen because there's some terrific hornbills and toucans that I used to do a lot with in Singapore. So, no, I think at the end of the day, I just keep, when I travel, I can't travel much now, but when the wife and everyone go shopping, I go to botanical gardens or birding. That's the way I look at it. I don't like shopping.
I don't think you're alone with that one, Neil. Have you kept a life list? Like, have you got a number that you can quote me?
No, I don't do the life list stuff. I collect a lot of the bird list, of course, over the years. And I handed some of that into the BirdLife WA bird notes I had here, some old paper stuff I had written up. And hopefully that'll just get locked into the databases. No, the life of birds has been fantastic. And I think one thing I always used to say to people that you never stop learning, and I'll never stop learning. And something that's one of those things that I've been passionate about, working and looking for. And that's the thing I put forward to a lot of people. It's one of those things I'll die not knowing, and there'll be a lot of other things I just won't get around to seeing or do. And I think that's an important thing about what we do with bird life and birds generally. Yeah, you never stop learning and sharing. I think sharing's important.
That's right. That's what it's all about, sharing the knowledge and the experiences. I think, Neil, I don't really need to ask you the final question because your previous answer, I think, has put you firmly on the experiential end of the bird nerd spectrum. You are not a compulsive or habitual twitcher. So I think that's where we wrap up. Thanks for giving me so much of your time.
For this more in the future.
I look forward to extending the conversation because something else in our discussion, dear listener, when we were setting up the interview, is Neil's appeared on both Totally Wild and Simon Townsend's Wonderworld. So for those of you of a similar age to me who know what I'm talking about when I reference Australia's wildlife heritage, will also know that Simon Townsend's Wonderworld was an absolute gem and one of the few places that we could meet on TV working conservation who weren't being presented in the ABC style. So beautiful stuff. Beautiful stuff. Well, thanks for being a friend of the show, Neil. Dear listener, thebirdemergency.com is alive. I've been telling people for years that the website is nearly ready. Now it's nowhere near complete, but at least you will find some really nice pictures and some really good stuff to listen to, and you will be seeing a lot more edited videos and a bit more polished production in the near future. So please go and have a look and give me some feedback if you'd like. Feel free to rate the show as well. Constructive criticism is always taken on board. But look, I've got a thick skin. It's okay if you want to be a hater. Okay, everyone, thanks so much for being part of the Bird Emergency. I'm Grant Williams. He's been Neil Hamilton. We'll see you another time. Bye.